In 2017, on the 15th of June at 4:36 p.m., the police received a phone call. But no one was talking on the other end. There was silence, a little bit of heavy breathing, and then they eventually hung up. It's protocol that if somebody calls 911, even if they don't speak, they have to trace the call and they have to go to that location. So the police trace the call and they see that it is coming from the Stockdale family farm. They're not immediately concerned. The Stockdale family's never had any problems. They're well liked in town, and so they're thinking maybe there's some sort of medical thing happening at worst, but it was likely just an unintentional call. They show up on the scene and they're greeted at the street level by the neighbors. The neighbors say, "Hey, we just heard like 10 to 15 gunshots." Again, the police aren't that worried. They're like, this is a farm. We know that the Stockdale family completely lives off of what they can grow on the farm, what animals they have at their disposal, and anything that they can barter for in town, and that's it. Hearing gunshots on a farm where they're eating the animals doesn't immediately raise a lot of red flags. The police approach the home, and as they're walking up to the front door, they hear an additional gunshot coming from inside the house. When this happens, the police are immediately on high alert. There is no reason why somebody would be firing a gun on a farm inside a home unless something was going terribly awry. They open the door, and immediately inside, there is a young man, early 20s, shotgun wound to the head, shotgun in his hand. They keep walking. They enter the next room in the home. There's another man, early 20s, shotgun wound, lying in a pile of blood. They go upstairs into the bathroom. They find a middle-aged woman lying in a pile of blood with a shotgun wound. Paramedics are immediately called, and when they arrive on the scene, they find that one of these individuals was actually still alive. Hi guys, and welcome back to another spooky Saturday. Sorry that I missed you guys last week. From now on my account, you will see before every Mukbang Monday or Spooky Saturday is uploaded, a few days in advance, I will have the video set as a premiere so that you can turn on alerts and you can save it for watch later in advance so that you never miss a Spooky Saturday or a Mukbang Monday ever again. Today, we're going to be talking about the Stockdale Family Murders, which are more commonly known as the wife swap murders. This family would infamously go on wife swap years before these murders would take place, and because of this, a lot of people have gone back and revisited those episodes, currently they're on Hulu, so that they can try and glean some insight into why this family was targeted, what could have happened, what might have gone wrong. When I first heard about this case, I knew that the name Stockdale sounded familiar. I watched Wife Swap a lot growing up, so initially I thought that was why, but after researching it for a while, it clicked in my brain. The reason Stockdale sounds familiar to me is because of the Stockdale paradox. The Stockdale paradox is a concept that predates this case by decades. It has literally nothing to do with this family, at least not intentionally. Let me know by the end of this video if you think the fact that this family is named the Stockdales and this paradox exists is at all ironic in any way, because I feel that it is. To survive a difficult situation, one must balance optimism with a realistic assessment of current reality, whatever the situation. By doing so, one can maintain hope while being prepared for the challenge ahead. On the surface of it, it might not be super obvious what that paradox is. The paradox is that you have to accept the brutal nature of whatever it is that you're going through in its entirety. You can't be in denial about how bad your situation is. However, you must still maintain optimism despite that, which many might feel is delusional, in order to make it through that thing. So simultaneously, you cannot be delusional about your circumstances, but you must be delusional about your ability to make it out in order to succeed. So let this little interlude act as foreshadowing, because I think that there's a dark sort of irony between the fact that this paradox has this same surname as this family. Kathy and Tim Stockdale met at university. They were both going to school for agriculture and they immediately hit it off. They bonded over their shared love of music. They had the exact same taste. They loved bluegrass, they loved country, they loved gospel, and they also bonded over their fundamentalist Christian beliefs. It was their dream that one day they would get married, they would have a whole host of kids, they would move out to a farm, and they would all live there happily together off of the land. 10 years after Tim and Kathy first met, they finally got married, and they immediately got busy. They would go on to have 4 sons, Calvin, Charles, Jacob, and James. Up until the late 90s, I would say the Stockdale family was living the same way that most American families are. The boys had friends, there were a lot of kids that lived in their neighborhood. Tim was working, Kathy was staying at home, taking care of the kids. And honestly, not to say that it was boring by any means, but there's just nothing notable about this period of time in the Stockdale family's life. But as the 90s came to a close, Kathy started getting increasingly worried about the influence of the neighborhood kids on her young boys. She noticed that a lot of the kids who lived in her neighborhood, they were drinking, they were smoking, and most horrifying of all to Kathy, they were listening to rap music. She decided this was no life for her boys. She talked it over with Tim and they agreed that it was finally time for them to move into their next phase of life and realize their dream, which was to live on a farm. So in 1999, they moved out into a 150-year-old farm in a remote part of Ohio. Once they were there, Kathy and Tim agreed that from now on, Kathy would homeschool the boys. They found a program for this through the Zion Reformed Church, which they were members of, and Kathy got straight to work. Kathy often described herself as a strict disciplinarian. So in addition to the boys having their lessons with her throughout the day, they also had a lot of responsibilities on the farm. Since Tim was out at work, the boys pretty much were the backbone of maintaining this farm. And it was a full-fledged farm. They had crops, they had livestock, they had to process this livestock and make it so that they had to process this livestock. But it doesn't just stop there. If you have a large farm, you require pretty intense equipment, and the boys were responsible for maintaining and even repairing that equipment as well.
You need to work and not expect to have a handout.
The work I have to do is sweep the porch, sweep all the downstairs, clear the table, unload the dishwasher. It's kind of boring after a while, doing it for about 8 years.
We raise a lot of our own vegetables. We raise all of the meat that we eat.
That one's dead. That one's a little bit not dead.
And in order to make sure that all of this was done in a timely manner, Kathy implemented a very strict schedule. From the moment that they woke up at the break of dawn until nighttime, Kathy had every minute of all 4 of her son's days planned out. On top of this, Kathy had implemented a token system. The best way that I can describe a token system is similar to like what a lot of summer camps do. My summer camp had a merit system where like if a kid did anything good, and there weren't really strict rules to this merit system, it was just like if they were kind or they did a good job cleaning up or they made their bed really nicely, they would get a merit. If they did something really bad, like yell at a kid or swear, they would get a demerit. And every so often, they would be able to go to the merit store and cash these merits in for a shirt or a teddy bear or a new water bottle. Or they could choose to save them and stack them over the course of several years until they could get something really big and super awesome. Kathy's token system worked essentially the same way. Every single time one of the boys did a chore, they would get a token. If they did a chore with a good attitude, they would get 2 tokens. If they did a chore with a bad attitude though, they would get a demerit. So they would still have to do the chore and they would get no tokens whatsoever. If they were late to dinner by even 1 minute, they would lose a token. And I'm sure you're wondering, what can they buy with these tokens? So they had about 3 special things that they could buy with the tokens. The first being a piece of gum. The next thing that they could buy is they could listen to an episode of a show, old school style, on a radio. Obviously, Kathy would pre-pick the show and it still had to be somewhat educational. And then if they saved up a lot of tokens, they could watch a movie, but Kathy would still be able to pick the movie and it was likely somewhat educational. Kathy had a strict no TV rule. She also had a strict no video games rule. There was no such thing as leisure time for the boys. Every single thing that they did throughout their day, if they had a spare moment, had to have some sort of expressed purpose. Surprisingly, the boys were actually allowed to have access to the internet, though Kathy would stand directly behind them while they were on the computer, and they had to be doing something educational. Otherwise, they were not allowed. Because Kathy believed everything you do in life has to have some sort of expressed purpose to it, the boys weren't really allowed to have friends. Let me clarify. The boys technically were allowed to have friends, but Kathy had to agree that there was a purpose to the friendship, and she had to sign off on it, which she never saw any purpose in any friendships, really, so she never signed off on it. And if you're wondering if there was any sort of recreational socialization, because everything has to have some sort of purpose, like sports have a purpose, maybe she let them play those. No. Kathy and Tim both felt that sports created a lot of negative personality traits. They felt like that sense of competition would only manifest poorly in young minds. What I find especially interesting and somewhat hypocritical about this is the only real way that the boys were able to engage with their peers was when Kathy would have them attend organized debate sessions. So the only way they really talked to other kids their age was in a debate scenario, which means that like all the socialization that these kids are getting at an early age is adversarial. And so you would think they would have the same mentality about that they have about the competition within sports, but apparently for some reason, since it's intellectualized, it's different. I don't know. But above all else, Kathy and Tim's most staunch rules surrounded dating. Unsurprisingly, none of the boys were allowed to date, at least not while they were in their house. The boys were taught that if they watched television or went on a date with a girl, that they would go to hell. More than that, the boys were taught that just like friendship, a relationship has to have an expressed purpose, and that purpose is marriage and children. So there is no reason to date as a minor. The first person that you date when you're an adult is the person who you're going to marry and then shortly thereafter have children with. That is the purpose of that interaction. Because of this, it seems that the boys didn't feel like they were missing out on any of these things. It was the only thing they knew. Well, most kids you would think would be upset that they don't get to play video games or watch TV. If they've never had a taste of that, they don't know what they're missing out on. In fact, from their perspective, their parents are saving them from eternal damnation. They're grateful that they don't get to do these things. The same is true of dating. They didn't feel that they were missing out because they felt like, I'm not ready to date because I'm not ready to have children and a wife. I'm only 16 years old, so why would I be dating? That also just reminded me, another thing that Kathy and Tim were really strict about was food intake. The boys were only allowed to eat things that they could grow or get from the farm. So no processed foods, no junk foods. Anything that they couldn't get from the farm, they had to get through bartering in town. So they wouldn't go out and like buy food either. There had to be some sort of trade that happened. They really were super old school in terms of how they operated their farm. Before you guys get too depressed, there was one super awesome thing that Kathy let the boys do, and they loved doing it, and that was music.
Family band that has great family values, the Stockdale Family Band.
It's a hard life, but it's a good life. That's the country life, been good to me.
The Stockdale Family Band has been around for about 3 years playing for the public. We have 4 sons, Calvin, who's 19, Charles, who's 16, Jacob, who's 15, and James, 11.
Being in the band teaches our children to work together. It allows them to earn money.
I really enjoy bluegrass music. You know, you don't find mandolin in many other genres.
I sell CDs. I manage the finances.
Because that's a skill. You're learning something. Kathy felt that the boys learning new instruments and working on music was a great productive use of their time. So in short order, all of the boys became prolific at a whole host of instruments because it was like their one leisure activity. The second youngest son, Jacob, was incredibly good at the fiddle. He played a lot of instruments, but he was notably really good at the fiddle. This was a bluegrass band and it was really wholesome, but it was also their one window to the outside world. If there was a talent show, if there was a music competition, if there was some sort of gig that the family could play, the boys would be allowed to go out and play. So they got to go up, and yes, there is still a certain degree of separation between them and the audience because they're on stage, so they're not directly interacting with people, but it did give them a chance to at least leave the farm, see the outside world a little bit. But more than that, it allowed the outside world to see them. And this is how wife swap comes into all of this. I'm sure you're thinking, a family like this, they don't even watch TV. Why would they end up on a reality TV show like Wife Swap? That just doesn't seem like something they would apply to. And the answer is, they didn't apply to it. Wife Swap sought them out. They were actually looking for a bluegrass or gospel or country family band because they already had a family lined up whose son was a rapper. And they wanted the antithesis of this family, and they thought it would be a nice parallel if there was a wholesome family band versus a young, edgy rapper. So when the Wife Swap producers approached Kathy, naturally Kathy said, no, this is obviously not Kathy's kind of thing. She doesn't want this kind of influence on her boys. But when the Wife Swap team came back at her and said, well, you know, we'll pay you $20,000 if you do it, Kathy and Tim rethought things. So in 2007, the Stockdale family finally agreed to go on Wife Swap. Anyone who's not familiar, I'm just gonna explain the premise of Wife Swap really quick. Wife Swap is a show, it started in the UK in 2003, where they would take two families who were supposed to represent polar opposites. They're supposed to be the antithesis of each other, take the wives and swap them. The first thing that they do every episode is they go into the family home, the family's not there, so they get to look around, see how these people live, try and get a general idea of their vibe. Because a person's home can say a lot about them. Then they sit down, usually in the kitchen, and they read the family rules. So this is always a very dramatic segment. They'll go through the list. What? No Skittles? Ugh, my whole family's obsessed with Skittles. This isn't gonna work. That's basically how like every single bullet point of these family rules go. The show takes place over a period of 2 weeks. The first week, the new wife has to go in and she has to just be a part of the family. She has to play the role of the original wife. So whatever rules this family's used to following that are in her list, she's got to do the same exact thing. No matter what it is, no matter how much she hates it, they almost always do, she has to follow the rules. The dads always love this. They're always like, wow, you can't hold a candle to my wife. You're terrible at washing dishes. Or like, wow, you suck at being in the corporate world. I can't believe that you even miss washing dishes. It's usually something like that. The second week is where things get real dramatic. That's when there's a huge upset. The second week, the new wife gets to implement her own rules of how the household is going to be run. This is usually a reflection of whatever she does in her own household, but a lot of the times she'll tweak her rules specifically to go against the grain of something that is a pillar of the current house's rules. And that's where all of the drama happens. Then after the 2 weeks are over, the wives go back to their original homes. They have like a "I missed you, honey" moment. Then the couples all gather together and they have like a reunion of sorts where they're like, "I loved your kids, but they're not having fun." Or "I loved your kids, but they've got no rules." Or like, "Your husband made this experience impossible. I don't know how you put up with him." Or "I think your husband's great. You're being too hard on him." It's usually something like that. Then they go back to their own houses and presumably they're supposed to learn a lesson from all of this as to how to find a healthy median. And basically like, okay, maybe before we were a no dairy household, but now if the kids say they want ice cream every once in a while, I guess it's all right. Show starts, Kathy packs up her bags. She hauls it to Northern Illinois to be a part of the Tonkovic family. And they're the original family that had applied to Wife Swap. And also, just like back to what I was saying before, it's not uncommon for producers to reach out to families purely because families like the Tonkovic family, they're more extroverted. They're more into this whole reality TV thing. So they're usually the personality type that tends to apply to a show like this. As for the more conservative, fundamentalist families that are usually paralleled against a family like this, the producers usually have to reach out to them because they're just not the personality type to apply. Kathy's going into this knowing, okay, the Tonkovic family, they're probably not gonna do things the same way that I do them, but like she's not a TV watcher, so it's not like she's watched thousands of hours of Wife Swap or anything. She might have watched an episode or two before she goes, but she has like a basic understanding of what it's gonna be. She gets there and she is horrified. The Tonkovic family has a real Jersey Shore vibe, you know? They are a party house. The parents, they don't clean. They're more of like a we're our kids' friends rather than we're our kids' parents kind of approach. The son is actually like 21, but he still lives in the house, and his girlfriend lives with him as well, and they share a bedroom. The younger daughter, who's only 17, her boyfriend also lives in the house with the parents, and he shares a bedroom with her too. Right off the bat, this is Kathy's worst nightmare. The first night that she's there, they throw an absolute rager. The son is getting up, he's drunk, he's been smoking, he's rapping, he's swearing, he's talking about suggestive topics. Kathy, her soul is about to escape from her body because this is just so like everything that Kathy fears happening to her children, happening before her eyes. And she can be quoted being like, it was distasteful, those lyrics, which is actually like very memeable. The Tonkovic family, they let the kids run the house. Whatever the kids want to do, they can do. And these aren't really like kids. They're pretty old, but they've been in this situation for a long time. It reminds me of how like when you're young, parents like this, you're always like, that's the cool house. They've got all the soda, they let us have parties there, they don't care what we're doing. It's awesome. I wish that was my parents. But then as you grow up, you look back at it and you're like, actually, that's a form of neglect as well. It's not like necessarily emotional neglect every single time, but these kids, they don't have any structure. They haven't learned how to self-regulate. There's no moderation in their lives. So they're not ultimately being prepared for the real world because they just have no sense of structure whatsoever. The mom, Lori, cleaned up a little bit, but the house was still in disarray. If the parents disappeared tomorrow, if Lori was out of the picture, no one would know how to do anything. These kids don't know how to do laundry, they don't know how to clean the dishes, they certainly don't know how to do taxes and all those other things. And those are just important skills to have as an adult. And it doesn't mean like all work, no play. It just means that sometimes you have to do things that aren't necessarily fun just for the sake of being self-sufficient. Even though these families are supposed to be the antithesis of one another, they actually do have some subtle similarities. The Tonkovic family, they're neglecting responsibility in their home. These children are neglected in a completely different way than the Stockdale family, yes, but they still are experiencing a certain degree of neglect. Whereas the Stockdale family, the emotional neglect is apparent. When Lori went over to the Stockdale house, that was also her worst nightmare. She said that the children were almost robotic in the way that they went about their day. That the way that they talked was completely off. It was so detached, it was so fearful that they knew exactly what they were supposed to do all day, every day. She actually didn't even have to really look at her notes of what she was supposed to be telling them to do because she really didn't have to tell them. They'd been already doing this exact same routine for years.
What would you do if you didn't have a schedule?
Like, just like not doing work.
Anything. No work.
I would have a lot more free time.
To do what?
Play around with my brothers.
God, I feel so sad for these kids.
By the end of the first day, Lori was actually fully in tears because although she might have a hard time asserting boundaries with her children, although she might need to grow up a little bit and step up and like be a mother instead of always being a friend, at the end of the day, she was still a very sweet woman. I think it really bothered her to see the fact that these children weren't really getting to be children. She was completely floored by the fact that they weren't allowed to have friends, that they didn't have any time to themselves unless it was devoted to developing some sort of skill set, which is like obviously the polar opposite of what she does in her home. Her children's lives revolve around their friends and parties and social events and being the hookup house. Their entire lives at this point in time, at least, are all about leisure activities, are all about intuitively doing whatever you feel like doing at that moment. The sheer concept of the token system completely demoralized her. She cried over that almost immediately. The idea that they had a 16-year-old son in the house who wasn't allowed to date really disturbed her. Especially because, like, if you look at her house is like the opposite of that to kind of an extreme degree, where she's like, oh, you're dating my kid? Welcome to the family. Move on in. Like, literally move on in. You don't have to get a job. You don't have to do any chores. It's fine. My kid loves you. I love you too. And like, again, that mentality at its core is sweet, but it is people pleasing to a problematic degree where, you know, maybe this isn't the safest situation for your teenage daughter to be in. Maybe we don't want to fully domesticate our high school sweetheart relationships while you're still in high school. I certainly wasn't raised with any sort of strictness. I went to like a hippie, new age private school, but even there, I don't think that there were any kids who lived with their significant others before graduation. Lori actually tried to talk to Charles about if he wanted to date girls, because in her mind, she's like, I'm sure he does and he's just not allowed to. But when she talked to him about it, he was like, oh no, I'm just not mature enough for that yet. Mind you, he's 16. He was like, I'm just not mature enough for that yet. You know, I'm not gonna date somebody until I'm ready to settle down. And Lori was like, oh my God.
Have you ever thought about dating?
I think I should wait for time when I can settle down.
She was trying to like explain to him that, like, gently, like, oh, do you feel like that's how everybody feels about it? But again, how would he know? Charles has no experience with how his peers are interacting with the dating world. He doesn't have any friends. Lori said that the environment was just really oppressive and that the token system and all of the chores, it just put entirely too much pressure on the kids and it broke her heart, basically. So then week 2 comes around, you know, the new moms are allowed to finally implement their own set of rules. Lori has been looking forward to this all week. She knows exactly what she's gonna do. The first thing that she does is she clears out the fridge and she brings in a ton of junk food. She gets pizza, she gets chips, she gets soda, she gets candy. She brings in a TV. She brings in video games, like gets them an Xbox. She tells them like, hey, great news. You guys are finally free to date whoever you want. When Tim hears the dating rule, he blows a gasket where he's like, this is my house. You're not gonna dictate things like that have huge implications. And she was like, actually, like, this is basically what she said. Actually, it's my house this week, so yes, I am.
I'm gonna be in control of my house.
No, you're not. It's my turn, baby, and you're gonna follow it.
I don't think so.
Lori's hype. She's like, these boys are finally gonna have some fun and they're gonna thank me for it. That's not what happened.
Certain things that we feel very strongly about.
Look, I know you do.
When Lori implemented all of these changes, the boys were very upset. You have to remember, they have no socialization. They have no one to compare their life experiences to. They don't know what is and isn't normal because they have nothing to compare it to and no one else to even look to from a distance and think like, oh, I wonder if they do things this way or that way. They wouldn't know. It's like they're living in this nightmarish snow globe with an authoritarian figure ruling over it, basically. When she tells him like, hey, you can watch TV, Jacob, the second youngest boy, he's like, I don't want to go to hell. Lori's like, oh my God, I only have a week to work with these kids and this is obviously something that's like better as a slow burn, but I really don't have the time for that. When she tries to get him to eat junk food, they're like, I'm worried about what my parents are gonna do to me. So I feel like a lot of audiences have come to the conclusion, and we'll get into this more from watching the episode, that the corporal punishment must have been pretty extreme based on the intense fear that the kids had when confronted with the concept of doing something that they knew their parents didn't want them to do, even though there were adults and a show there telling them it's fine. One of Lori's rules was that Calvin and Charles had to go on a date that week. And I'm gonna show the footage from the episode of that. They are devastated. And honestly, it's to a point where like, I don't know how to feel about it. I don't know how to feel about it. I know it's just a date. But, you know, everything is relative, and it feels kind of yucky to me. I don't think this was Lori's intention. It feels kind of yucky to me, though. It feels like this is just sort of a violation of consent on a level, to be honest with you.
Certain things that we feel very strongly about.
Look, I know you do.
Would you make them try it?
I will make them not listen to your father and choose on their own without his influence.
She seems to think that she's opening us up to see her way. I'm afraid what it would do emotionally to the younger ones.
I know that ultimately the boys were better for it because they did end up going on the double date, and actually afterwards they said that they had a great time and it was a positive experience for them. But it just gave me a lot of anxiety to watch, like, just how much like internal turmoil they felt at the very concept. It made me feel weird. I don't know. I didn't like it. I understand where Lori's coming from. And again, they ended up being better off for it, but in an ideal world, I think that could have gone better. I know that there just like wasn't a lot of time, and this was like the one opportunity though. So it's like, we don't live in an ideal world, but I just wanted to like put that out there. Even though Jacob, the second youngest, had initially cried at the prospect of watching television, him and James, they started playing some video games. Lori was like, look, it's fun. And Jacob was like, yeah, you know what? Actually, I do really like video games, even though it's kind of like mind-numbing and like not productive, which I thought was cute in kind of a sad way, just because it was like, yeah, you are used to everything being a means to some sort of ends, whereas video games, unless you're like being really competitive about it, are basically just a leisure activity for most people. Like, there is no express goal beyond like beating the game or getting to the next level. The stakes are very low.
With chores banned, the boys have been playing video games all morning, and it's Tim's responsibility to do all the work around the farm.
What do you guys think about this?
It's fun for the present. It has no value, really, at
I
time.
feel guilty right now, but I love it.
I believe my children are becoming mind-numb robots, totally oblivious to everything else that's going on.
You can actually see while James is playing, he says, I'm having a really good time, though I do feel kind of guilty for doing it. He was the youngest, so it was easiest for him to adapt to all the rule changes, whereas the older boys had a notably harder time. Meanwhile, I'm sure y'all are wondering, what was Kathy doing over at the other house? Once she had control, what the heck was Kathy doing? First thing she did was she got rid of that TV. The first thing she did was she got rid of that TV. She got rid of the video games. She threw out all the processed food. One thing that I like that Kathy did is the oldest son, who was like a white rapper, she didn't take rap away from him. I thought that she was gonna be like, you're no longer a rapper, you're gonna be the next Johnny Cash. But actually no, she was like, you can keep your genre. All I ask is that you have to make wholesome, family-friendly rap for the week, which actually I think is a pretty good creative exercise. It doesn't mean he has to do it forever, but I think it's a way for him to interact with his music creating in a unique way. It puts new constraints on it. He has to think, maybe be a little bit more creative about how he does his punchlines and setup. So I actually think ultimately that probably, even though I don't think this was necessarily Kathy's goal, I think ultimately it probably helped him grow as a musician. So actually I support that one, especially because it only lasts a week, so it's not like he has to do that forever. So it's really sort of just like a fun musical exercise. And honestly, that was basically how he took it. Well, Kathy's children were having a really, really hard time adjusting to these new changes. These kids were fine with the changes. You would think that introducing a lot of structure into their lives all of a sudden would be difficult for them, but they actually adjusted pretty well, which is not to say that there weren't any huge fights. There were.
It's time for Kathy to hand out tokens for chores, but Sam's having trouble understanding the token system.
We worked hard all day. You don't have to give us little merits and have a big organized chart. It's okay to clean and just do it for the cleaning, not for rewards.
I'd be happy to give you some more materials.
But are you going to learn anything from us? Like, not be so closed-minded about everything?
I'm closed-minded?
Yeah.
You don't have a job, Samantha. You're living at someone else's home. You're mooching off of this family.
Okay, can I say something now, Kathy? Because
You know
now
what?
you're crossing the line
No.
because she is not mooching off of our family.
I don't mooch anything off of these people. I help them out as much as I can.
You know what, ma'am? I don't ever want to hear disrespect
To my family, again, she doesn't mooch a damn thing off of us.
It kind of broke the camel's back right there. You don't say derogatory things when we haven't said one thing towards Kathy.
The rest of the family got really defensive, like, hey, don't say that to her. She's not a leech. We like her. We want her to be here. So there were definitely moments like that. I'm not trying to make it sound like there was no drama and they were just like, okay, Kathy, we'll follow all of your rules. But they certainly had an easier time adjusting to the rule changes, mainly because these kids are heavily socialized. They probably have an innate understanding that other people's lives look differently than theirs. They have a lot of friends, and I'm sure their friends have a lot of different upbringings. Even if they are all sort of in the party scene, something that is intrinsic to a party is just a large volume of people. And with any large volume of people, there's going to be a spectrum of experience. And so these kids, through that socialization, have more of an understanding that, like, yeah, people have different parenting styles, and therefore it was easier for them to adjust. This is not to say that Kathy didn't pull out some crazy rules.
Each of you will wear a censored wristband, and whenever the baby is in a position that is bad for it, then it's going to cry and you're going to have to take care of its needs.
With great power and freedom comes great responsibility. That wasn't that bad. You know, like, they do that in health class for a reason. Okay. It's a little weird maybe, but you know, the message is clear. I'm getting the moral. Then Kathy sat down the two couples. All four of the kids were on the couch. And she brought in a priest.
Samantha and Hector, you both get all the benefits of being in this family, but you're not. Are either of you prepared to marry into this family right this second?
She was like, you guys all live together in the same home, and you say that you're serious about this relationship. So if you're comfortable sleeping in the same bed, then surely you're comfortable with getting married right now. Obviously, no one got married, because that's crazy, Kathy. That's like, marriage is not just like a piece of paper the way everyone makes it sound. Actually, you know what? Maybe it is. But that paper is a legally binding contract that has a lot of implications and can vastly change the trajectory of your life and your finances and your mental health. So it is a huge decision. Because of that, naturally, nobody got married. But when nobody agreed to get married on the spot in the living room, Kathy was like, okay, well, now the boys are sleeping in the same room and the girls are sleeping in the same room. You guys no longer get to sleep in the same bed, since clearly you're not serious about these relationships. The second week, it's coming to a close, right? The parents, they're gonna do their reunion, they're meeting up. Right when they all sit down, Lori immediately comes at Kathy's throat, in essence, where she's like, I eventually got used to Tim. I love the kids, but it seems to me that you're the problem, Kathy. You are the authoritarian force in these young men's lives. You are far too controlling. You have them acting a nervous wreck. You have them in shambles over the mere suggestion of normalcy. That is unacceptable. Like, she's not being that eloquent about it, but she's going in at Kathy, where she's like, basically, you're the problem. She goes as far to say that, like, not only is Kathy the reason they're walking on eggshells, she's the reason they move through life so robotically, and that they talk the way that they do, because they're just so desensitized to the normal way of doing things, and they're just honestly traumatized by Kathy. So naturally, with all this in mind, when the show aired, viewers felt like the Stockdale family was incredibly abusive. A lot of people also felt like the Tonkovic family was an example of poor parenting, but it was just like not at the same level, where they were like, your worst crime is you're trying too hard to be friends with your kids, you're not being parents, these kids need guidance, step it up. But with the Stockdale family, they felt like this is severe child abuse. These children are living under insane circumstances. Every minute of their day is regulated and controlled. They have no socialization. They have no idea of the outside world. You've brainwashed these children. But with all this in mind, there is something incredibly important to point out. Wife Swap is reality TV. Reality TV, contrary to the name, not always real. And Wife Swap in particular has been exposed a lot. It's experienced a lot of controversy. Wife Swap has caused divorces. Wife Swap has caused people to get fired because of how badly they looked on TV. Wife swap has even caused people to kill themselves. Literally, wife swap has caused a suicide. And what makes matters worse is a lot of the time, the reason that these things are happening is because wife swap has inaccurately portrayed somebody. Either the editing is so heavy-handed and taken out of context to such an extreme degree that it makes people look terrible, to a point where sometimes they even just take random words, stitch them together to create a sentence that never was, or it's just fully scripted. There have been a lot of testimonials from families who have gone on the show who have said that the producers literally made them play a part, where they had to read off a script, they had to say certain things so that certain scenes could take place. There's also been testimonies that like the houses don't even really look like that. They bring in a lot of props, they move things around. And what I think is most interesting is like the show doesn't actually take place over the course of 2 weeks. It takes place over the course of 1 week, but they film 14-hour days. And they even black out the windows when they want to make it appear like it's nighttime, even though it might still be daytime. But the thing that surprised me in particular is the family rules that like the new wives get when they walk in. I always thought that was written by the moms, because that's the way the show makes it. Call me gullible, but it was written by the producers. It is still somewhat accurate. They interview the parents, they ask like, what do you do on a daily basis? How do you run your house? And then the producers write it out. But because they're not the ones specifically writing it out, of course the producers have the creative license to make it a little bit more dramatic, ham it up. And let's not forget, this is a Spooky Saturday video. The video is not just about a potentially abusive home. The video is about the Stockdale Family Murders. So after information came out that these murders had occurred, immediately everyone is rushing to rewatch Wife Swap. They want to know, is there any information we can glean from this episode that might give insight into why things went the way that it did? That's why I'm including that it is not necessarily a reliable narrative. That being said, Kathy, after Wife Swap, revamped the family band's website. Because of Wife Swap, like I said, the kids were actually incredibly talented musicians. The family band was more popular than ever. They were actually doing pretty well before this. They were getting gigs. They were doing good. They were well known in their local community at the very least, and a little bit beyond. But after Wife Swap, they were booking gigs nationally. Kathy started a YouTube channel for the family band. It's actually still up. They've got a little under 500 subscribers. You can go watch their videos right now. She revamped the family band website. And the reason why this is relevant to whether or not this Wife Swap episode was an accurate portrayal is because on the family band website, she includes the family rules. She hasn't altered them or changed them. They are the exact rules from the Wife Swap episode, which leads a lot of people to believe that even though she didn't write those rules out herself, that she at least felt it was a very accurate depiction of their daily life. Otherwise, why would she have it published on the family band's website? On top of this, even though Kathy isn't much of a TV person, obviously, she would get social media after all of this, and she would constantly post on social media for people to go rewatch the Wife Swap episode. So it seems to me and to a lot of other people that Kathy, at the very least, was very proud of how her family was portrayed on this show. And it seems to me that you wouldn't feel proud of how your family was portrayed if they were portrayed inaccurately. And like, okay, let's give it the benefit of the doubt. Maybe you would be proud of how your family was portrayed, even if it's inaccurate, if it made them look better than they are. But again, there was immense backlash to this episode because people felt that she was an abusive mother. So one would think that then, keeping that in mind, if it did make her look better than she actually is, it means it made her look less abusive. Because it's not like people were coming to a false conclusion that she was absolutely killing it as a mom. People were criticizing her heavily. So what happened to the families after the show? Okay. The Stockdale family, at the very least, they actually lightened up. One of the new token prizes was that the boys would be allowed to play video games. So obviously the boys had told Kathy, like, hey, We got the chance to play games and we actually really love it, and Kathy respected that decision. The 2 oldest boys were actually allowed to get Facebook accounts as well, which is something they didn't have before. One thing that is definitely inaccurate about the wife swap episode, as far as the Stockdale family goes, is it made it look like all 4 sons were still in the house, when the reality is that Calvin was already off at university, but it just made it a little bit more streamlined for him to be in the home, I suppose. By the time the episode airs, Calvin and Charles are now at university. And while they're off at college, you know, they're not going to a remote school and living at home. They're actually out in the world. They're free to do whatever they want to do. And their parents are like, now that you're out, you're out. We're not going to be controlling your life on a day-to-day basis, which I think is probably surprising to a lot of people that they were immediately able to let go to that degree. And because the family band was so successful, Calvin and Charles, they would come, they would play the gigs. The family still had a lot of quality time together, even though they were off living their own adult lives. It's not like it was a situation where they got out and then they never looked back. They still came back home, they visited with their parents, and it seemed like they actually had a very normal situation moving forward. So this family band's doing incredibly well. They're doing their gigs across the whole country. They're also participating in a lot of talent shows, which they almost always won, because again, they were all incredibly good musicians, but especially Jacob. He was really prolific at the fiddle, like seriously, seriously good. And for Jacob, who was now like the oldest son in the home still, the band really became like the epicenter of his life. Now we're gonna skip forward almost a decade. 9 years. James, the youngest of the 4 boys, is 21 years old at this point in time. He's off at college. He even has a girlfriend. Calvin and Charles, the 2 eldest brothers, have settled down, which leaves Jacob. Jacob, who is the 2nd youngest, 3rd eldest, was still at home. He was 25 years old and he had decided that he didn't want to go to college. We don't really have any details on why he didn't go, but it doesn't seem like it was like an academic issue or anything like that. I'm getting the impression that it just wasn't really something he wanted to do. And if you're thinking that college was sort of the great divide, which allowed these kids to go out and be independent for the first time, and wondering if that means that Jacob didn't get to have that same experience, no. Apparently, even though he had never left the home and he had stayed on the farm, because he was 25 years old, his parents respected that he was an adult and he was basically allowed to do whatever he wanted. He wasn't like this eternal child or anything like that. He said that he wanted to stay at home because he truly loved working on the farm and his only other love in life was music. And at this point, the family band, it wasn't disbanded, but it was sort of reorganized because Calvin and Charles, like I said, had settled down. They had their own families now, and for them, they just felt like they needed to step back from the band purely for time purposes. Like they needed to spend time with their developing families. So they renamed the band the Stockdale Brothers because at this point it was just Jacob and James, and they were sort of the perfect duo for a 2-man band, honestly, because James, the youngest of all of the boys, he was super extroverted, he was charismatic, he would make jokes on stage, and everybody loved him. Whereas Jacob was this incredibly talented fiddle player, and even though he was a little bit more shy and a lot more serious, it just was the perfect counterweights, and people really enjoyed watching their dynamic unfold on stage. Whenever Jacob wasn't playing in the band or working on the farm, he would go into town and he would teach the local kids music. He was a music teacher. That was sort of his like side gig, and he was really popular. People loved learning from him and everybody had great experiences. James had been enrolled in a local college, which meant that whenever him and Jacob had gigs, he could easily come back home. It seemed like the family had really hit their stride. All 4 of the boys were fully functional, independent adults. They were all following their dreams. They were all settled. The parents had taken a step back. They were no longer controlling every facet of their children's lives. They recognized their independent adults were no longer in charge of them. We're no longer here to tell them what to do. We've now transitioned into this more mentorship role where, you know, we're always going to be their parents. We're always going to be there for them if they need us, if they want guidance. We're certainly here to offer that, but we don't dictate the ins and outs of their day-to-day. Overall, it just seemed that the family was closer than ever. Everybody was following their dreams. Everybody was doing so well. Everything was so great, which is why it was so surprising when Jacob killed his family. When the police heard that gunshot from inside the home, that man who was lying just on the other side of the door with a shotgun in his hand was Jacob. When they went into the next room, the man lying in a puddle of blood was James. And when they went upstairs, the woman collapsed in the bathroom bleeding. was Kathy. When paramedics arrived on the scene, they discovered that Jacob was still alive. Jacob had killed his mother and his younger brother, called the police, and then once he had seen and confirmed that the police had entered the property, tried to take his own life, but failed. Calvin and Charles were at their homes with their families when this had all happened, and Tim was actually away on a work trip. When the police called them and informed them, all of them were shocked. When they asked if there was any sort of conflict between Kathy and Jacob and James, they were all at a loss for words. They couldn't think of anything that could result in something like this. They couldn't even think of something that maybe they had been arguing over recently. They all testified to the fact that, at least from what they knew, Jacob seemed to be of sound mind. It didn't seem to them that he was struggling with any sort of mental health issues, which doesn't mean that he wasn't, by the way. Some people are better at masking those issues than others. Sometimes you end up having a blip or some sort of break where it just comes out of seemingly nowhere and you've had this underlying issue that you never knew about. So I'm not trying to say that this means that he was completely sound when the event occurred. All I'm saying is we don't have any evidence currently to suggest that he was not. Jacob's injuries from his self-inflicted gunshot wound were all life-altering injuries. When he was taken to the hospital, his fundamentalist church he belonged to, the Zion Reformed Church, actually created a GoFundMe for him and raised over $30,000 for all of his treatments and surgeries. He underwent several rounds of treatment and reconstructive surgery, and even though he would ultimately come out on the other side of that, facially disfigured, blind, and with metal fragments forever embedded in his brain, after a year, he had reached his new normal, and experts agreed that he had fully healed. So 14 months after the murders, Jacob was officially charged for the murder of his younger brother James and his mother Kathy. Finally, for the first time in this entire case, investigators were able to question Jacob. So when they began their official investigation, now that he was fully healed, they were ready to figure out a motive, nail down some answers. But when they went to talk to Jacob, he didn't say anything. When Jacob went to trial, his attorneys argued that he was not guilty by reason of insanity, and the judge actually did agree that, at least at this time, he was not fit to stand trial. So he was transferred to a psychiatric facility. A brief thing on that, there seems to be this misunderstanding by the general public that it is better to be found not guilty by reason of insanity than it is to be found guilty with a sound mind. The reality is, it's not like you're going to be staying in some sort of hotel and you just get to take a Xanax. You're undergoing heavy treatment. While Jacob was there, he actually tried and failed to escape on 2 separate occasions. So after Jacob had undergone treatment for a year, he was officially deemed fit to stand trial. Unfortunately, Jacob's trial was scheduled for March of 2020. We all know what happened then. So the pandemic hit, it created a massive backup in the justice system. So it wouldn't be for another full calendar year, March 2021, till Jacob actually went to trial. Jacob was going into this trial maintaining a not guilty plea, but a week before the trial was supposed to take place, he actually changed his plea to guilty. So there was really no trial. There was no cross-examination. And Jacob was sentenced with 15 years per murder consecutively, which meant that he would serve 30 years in total. What's frustrating about this for a lot of people, I'm sure for people who know this family as well as strangers, is there's no closure. We never get answers as to why Jacob did this, as to what was going on. Was this some sort of mental health crisis? Did he experience some sort of episode? Was it because of the conditions under which Jacob was raised? Was it built up resentment? Was there something happening with the band? We have no idea why he did this, and it does not look like he's interested in telling us. More than that, a lot of people wonder if he even knows why he's done it, because the damage that he experienced from shooting himself in the head was so severe. Some people think he might not even remember. He might not know why he did what he did. It's entirely possible that we will truly never know why things happened the way that they did, which is why, even though people were always going to tune into this wife swap episode just to get context on this case, people are really relying on the wife swap episode. That's why it's really important to take into account it might not be the most legitimate example of this family's day-to-day, but it's also important to take into account the fact that Kathy seemed to stand by the depiction of her family. So maybe this is a situation where it actually was pretty accurate. We don't really know. What I do know is that people who know the family, people who are friends of Kathy, stand by her. They really do. They say that Kathy was a sweet woman. Although she had a strict parenting style, she did love her boys. She thought she was doing the right thing. Her boys loved her too. This wasn't an abusive situation. Again, this is not what I'm saying. This is what people who knew Kathy said. Basically, they are determined to sort of exonerate her. And a lot of people who know and love Kathy feel that when people say that her parenting style is the reason why this happened, they feel like it's victim blaming, because at the end of the day, Jacob is alive and Kathy's dead. And no matter what you feel about Kathy or Jacob, I think we can all agree that James is an absolutely tragic loss. He was this young, extroverted guy. He had a girlfriend. He was finally getting out there. He was only 21 years old. He had so much ahead of him. And so regardless of the circumstances, I think that is what really puzzles people about this situation. It's easy for people to look at the wife swap episode and draw a connection between Kathy's parenting style and what ultimately happened, because that's what wife swap is about at its core, is parenting styles. But when it comes to what the motive behind killing James was, it's really just a big question mark. I welcome you guys to speculate. Tell me your theories. Tell me what you think happened, what you don't think happened. If you think the episode is based more in reality or if it's more fictional. But while you're doing that, please remember, this is a crime that took place pretty recently. This happened in 2017. People who know and love this family are alive and well. Many of them might even be on YouTube. So whether you agree or disagree with anything anyone in this video has done, please just try and keep it respectful in the comments. I would just hate for anybody who knows this family to see something that upsets them. And I tried my best to depict this story in a fair way. I know that the way that I talked about a lot of Kathy's decisions may come off as critical, and that's because I am critical of some of Kathy's choices. But at the end of the day, do I think anybody deserves to be murdered? Of course not. Of course no one deserves to be murdered. So let's just keep it respectful in the comments, please. I'll see you next Saturday, and if you want something more lighthearted, you just have to wait a couple days because a Mukbang Monday will be dropping this week. It's about Marie Antoinette, and I hope you guys love it. And not to be this guy, but don't forget to like and subscribe. Bye!